Hey, good afternoon, everybody. I want to thank everyone for joining us for this kickoff event as we roll out President Biden's FY25 budget request for the Department of Defense. This afternoon, we have joining us the 35th Deputy Secretary of Defense, Kathleen Hicks, and the 12th Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Christopher Grady. Deputy Secretary Hicks will provide some opening comments, and then she'll be followed by Admiral Grady, who will also provide a few comments. Once they're finished, I'll call on members of the audience for questions. And with that, I'll turn it over to Deputy Secretary Hicks.
Terrific. Thank you to Eric, and good afternoon to everyone. It's really a pleasure to be with you here today alongside Admiral Grady to discuss President Biden's fiscal year 25 defense budget request. I'd first like to take a moment to recognize that as I stand before you today, Congress has not yet passed the FY24 defense budget. So before I begin, I want to highlight how devastating the failure to pass last year's budget request is to ensuring our national defense and global security. Last year, the department released the most strategy-aligned budget in DoD history. It allocated critical resources consistent with our defense priorities as outlined in the 2022 National Defense Strategy and the President's National Security Strategy. We buckled down and did our homework. Our primary goal was to fortify our national defense against emerging and enduring threats to our nation and the international order as we know it. First and foremost, the FY24 budget treats our pacing challenge, the People's Republic of China, with the urgency it requires, directing resources to sustain and strengthen U.S. deterrence. It delivers a combat-credible joint force, one aimed at deterring and, if called upon, defeating foreseeable and future threats. And it makes a series of investments in our most powerful and valuable asset, our people, and ensuring that we can recruit, retain, train, and equip them so that they remain resilient, ready, and focused on fulfilling their mission. Congress's inability to pass the FY24 budget, holding back much-needed funding, hinders our ability to execute that strategy. The department has no way around that reality. Instead, we have been strapped with a series of continuing resolutions. CRs are a significant constraint on our ability to advance our defense strategy, forcing the department to operate with one hand tied behind our back for months out of the year, even as we confront new and evolving security challenges each and every day. We cannot continue this cycle of continuing resolutions. We also cannot continue punting the ball on our supplemental funding request in support of Ukraine in its fight against Russian aggression. And we cannot continue to stall on approved supplemental funding for Israel and humanitarian assistance in Gaza to help contain the spread of conflict and promote regional stability. And we cannot pass up on a critical opportunity to support our allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific with supplemental funding for foreign military assistance and financing. So we need Congress to come together. The world is watching what we do in this moment. It's tracking whether we can unite and overcome the headwinds facing our national security and our democracy. And our adversaries, in particular, are observing our willingness to step forward for our allies and partners. So we must continue to make progress, critical to projecting power and protecting our people and our republic. Progress that will stoke innovation and bolster our ability to upgrade our systems, acquire new capabilities, and launch new initiatives. Progress that increases the resilience and lethality of the joint force. Progress that advances our multi-domain power, strengthening our ability to deter strategic attacks against the United States, our allies, and partners. And progress that enables us to develop capabilities and operational concepts needed to deter aggression paced to the growing multi-domain threat posed by the PRC in the Indo-Pacific. This progress cannot wait. Our nation must meet its responsibility to our forces to pass on-time appropriations so that these goals can be realized. This year's FY25 defense budget request at $849.8 billion would build on and advance generational military investments we've put in motion over the past several years. For the fourth year in a row, our budget furthers our goals to defend the nation, take care of our people, and succeed through teamwork. Unlike our prior budgets, however, the FY25 request is capped by the Fiscal Responsibility Act. Because of these statutory caps and as good stewards of taxpayer dollars, we made smart, responsible choices to work within those limits. The result is a strong focus on executability and necessary emphasis on near-term readiness and people investments. But to be clear, we must grow the defense budget in the out years of our future years defense program if we want to achieve the goals of the National Defense Strategy, especially in the face of rapid modernization by the PRC. Now, budgets are statements of priorities, and we used a rigorous process guided by our strategy to arrive at the resourcing determinations we've made. That process included close dialogue and collaboration among senior DoD leaders representing every defense component, military service, and combatant command. Together, we remained singularly focused on identifying the programs and plans that best meet the demands of today's warfighters and their families while making smart investments in the future. That's vital because since day one, Secretary Austin and I have emphasized the urgency to innovate. One key focus in innovation is overcoming institutional challenges that inhibit our ability to accelerate delivery of critical capabilities to the warfighter at speed and scale. That's the goal of Replicator, including its first focus area on all-domain attritable autonomous systems and many similar initiatives the department has underway. So even under the FY25 cap, we continue to make investments in basic research, advanced technology, experimentation, artificial intelligence, and cyber and space capabilities. And we are committed to robust procurement, sending strong market signals to industry. Take, for instance, space. Last year, our investments in space capabilities were the largest ever. The FY25 budget continues the department's commitment to space, investing nearly $34 billion to keep space safe for military, civilian, and commercial operations. In support of our first ever National Defense Industrial Strategy, we're increasing investments in casting and forging, more than double that of last year. Other key investments focus on strengthening our munitions and defense industrial base and improving the resilience of our supply chains so that we can deliver what our warfighters need when they need it. For example, the FY25 budget request makes an historic investment in the submarine industrial base to increase production and reduce backlogs. We'll continue to work together to increase munitions investments, and I appreciate Congress's partnership in ensuring that we have the authorities we need to get the right capabilities in the hands of our warfighters, allies, and partners. Top of their list is multi-year procurement authority, which is a proven and powerful tool to meet immediate threats, support the defense industrial base, and surge and maintain munitions procurements. We've awarded our first 4 multi-year procurement contracts. We've made significant investments in the munitions industrial base, and we know that multi-year procurement will be even more effective when we receive appropriations that allow us to move out on these authorities. Our investments will go toward deepening our relationship with our allies and partners, and these robust investments reflect our nation at our best, sparking innovation, leading with our allies and partners, and defending our democracy against those forces that would do us harm. Our FY25 budget request also upholds our commitment to our people, the service members, military families, and civilians who work tirelessly to defend this nation day in and day out. As Secretary Austin said, our success in defending the nation and maintaining readiness is inextricably linked to their success. That's why this budget focuses on their economic stability and family support, the cores of our Taking Care of People initiatives. The budget funds must-pay items related to quality of life and quality of service, such as a 4.5% pay raise for our service members that builds on raises for the past 3 years in a row, including last year's 5.2% pay raise. With this budget, our service members will have received an 18% increase in base pay during this administration. But we know that compensation is about more than just pay. It's about increasing the number of child development centers where military families can educate their children and the number of providers in those centers. It's about the conditions on ships and in barracks. It's about what we're doing to build healthy and resilient communities. And that's why the must-pay items in this budget also include basic housing allowance increases, facility investments in safe, quality family housing to enhance deterrence and improve critical operational infrastructure, making healthcare, healthy food, and childcare more accessible, including increasing pay for childcare providers, and building a safer workplace, including efforts to combat sexual assault and to prevent suicide and eliminate barriers to care. All must-haves, not nice-to-haves, that enable our total force to thrive so that they maintain focus on their mission. And it doesn't end there. We are only able to successfully defend the nation because of the support of the American people. We work to earn and maintain their trust each and every day by being good stewards of taxpayers' hard-earned dollars. And we know that a good measure of trust lies in our progress toward a clean audit. I'm proud to highlight that several weeks ago, the U.S. Marine Corps became the first military service to achieve a clean audit. The level of rigor and discipline and teamwork involved in achieving this milestone serves as a model for teams across the department moving forward and brings us one step closer to achieving an overall clean report by 2027 as required by law. We will continue to improve our performance and optimize our processes, practices, and systems across the department to deliver the nation's warfighters and taxpayers as effectively and efficiently as possible. This budget advances our nation's defense in the face of an historically challenging strategic, resource, and operational environment. Our military readiness depends on our ability to pass timely appropriations, FY24, FY25, and every year thereafter. So I cannot emphasize this enough. We need predictable, adequate, sustained, and timely funding, full stop. We cannot afford any more lost time that we cannot buy back. So we urge Congress to work together to pass this budget request and last year's and the National Security Supplemental too, with the requisite urgency that our nation's defense demands. With the right tools and timely resources, we can meet all of our well-established defense priorities and outpace our competitors as we've so carefully planned. And together we will. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary Hicks, and thank you for your leadership. So on behalf of the Chairman and the Joint Force, welcome here to this briefing today, and it is a privilege to represent the 2.1 million total force soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, and Guardians as we discuss the Department of Defense's fiscal year 2025 President's Budget Request. Like our FY23 and 24 submissions before this, we are approaching the FY25 budget request with our national defense strategy and our national military strategy at the front of our mind as our North Star. Our $849.8 billion budget prioritizes national security through integrated deterrence, campaigning, and building enduring advantages to ensure that the Joint Force is able to defend the homeland, deter strategic attacks and aggression, all while positioning the Joint Force to prevail in conflict if necessary. Our strategy-driven approach is focused on the security challenges of today, while also modernizing the Joint Force to meet the challenges of tomorrow, delivering on the strategic discipline that is at the heart of the national military strategy. For integrated deterrence, the FY25 budget requests funds critical to investments in our national enterprise, nuclear enterprise and missile defense, along with space capabilities, which will allow the Joint Force to address key modernization priorities while also ensuring that we build the capabilities to support critical kill webs. And it continues to invest in priority areas that will enable the department to strengthen our cyberspace activities and to expand our long-range fires capabilities. To support campaigning, the department is investing in readiness initiatives for operations, training, and maintenance, while also prioritizing exercises and experimentation that will allow the Joint Force to support our critical theaters, including Indo-PACOM and Europe. We do this through investments in things like missile defense resilient communications and interoperability initiatives, so critical with our allies and partners. The Joint Force also looks to build out our enduring advantages. This includes investing in our people, the center of the universe. It is also a means for us to continue to fund innovation through Replicator and other efforts. Meanwhile, supporting the defense industrial base and supply chains using multi-year procurement authorities reduces costs and provides a consistent demand signal to our industry partners. As we still await the FY24 appropriations, I want to reiterate that the Joint Force is best positioned to maintain and build on our enduring advantages when we receive sufficient, timely, sustained, and predictable funding. And a return to predictable and routine resourcing will help ensure that the Joint Force continues to meet the nation's national security needs. Our current strategic advantage gives us confidence against any adversary, but our competitors and our adversaries have not stopped advancing their capabilities. So we must continue to adapt, advance, and innovate at speed and at scale across all domains, prioritizing China as the pacing challenge and Russia as an acute threat. Our strategy-driven budget does exactly that. It recognizes the need to invest in key areas to translate the national defense strategy, the national military strategy, and the joint warfighting concept into operational capabilities required to deter our strategic competitors. While resourcing our strategy and making the necessary investments, the Joint Force can and will remain the most capable force in the world for decades to come. So thank you for joining us today. Madam Secretary, thank you for your leadership and your words today. And again, it is my distinct privilege to be here and represent the commitment and the dedication of our entire Joint Force.
Okay, now we'll go to questions. Tara Kopp from AP.
Hi, Secretary Hicks. I wanted to first ask about Ukraine. A senior defense official who briefed us in advance of this budget said that DoD is actually about $10 billion in the hole when it comes to Ukraine. And I wanted to get your thoughts on how do you replenish that? How do you get the munition stocks back to where they need to be without a supplemental? And if we go into another CR? And then for Admiral Grady, I wanted to see if you could just talk to us about the readiness impact of having yet another CR on ship availability, on squadrons getting flight hours, the real life impacts that you see in the forces.
Thanks very much on the issue of the supplemental, and in particular the $10 billion replenishment that would be provided for under that supplemental. We don't foresee a likely alternative outside of the supplemental funding or having that money added into an appropriation bill in order to achieve the replenishment that we need. So we are absolutely laser focused right now on making the case to the American people about the need for that supplemental, about the $50 billion roughly of investment that flows back to the U.S. economy and supports businesses large and small throughout the country, and also helps warm up our industrial base for our own war fighters so that they can get the munitions they need in a timely manner when crises arise.
So what happens if you don't get the replenishment? You don't get the $10 billion?
We don't get the $10 billion. We would have to find other means. We right now are very much focused on the need for that supplemental.
Yeah, continuing resolutions are always a challenge, and certainly it requires us to make difficult decisions going forward. You're very familiar with things like new starts and how it might impact personnel initiatives or shipbuilding and ship maintenance, as you point out, munitions production, replenishment, those kind of things. As to our ability to maintain readiness, as the deputy said, readiness and what we need to fight tonight remains at the forefront of our budget deliberations this year, and I'm pretty confident that we will be able to maintain things like flying hours and ship depot maintenance going forward. We have to keep a really close eye on it, though, because sometimes that becomes a bill payer. Thanks to the Secretary and the Chairman, that has not to this point, and we'll watch it very closely.
Appreciate it. We'll go to Mike Stone from Reuters next.
Thanks. Madam Secretary, I don't see a line in this budget for Replicator. Can you tell us what's going to be spent this year, next year on Project Replicator? And for Admiral Grady, can you tell us the top two things that China should take note of in this budget? There's a huge increase, for instance, in long-range anti-ship missiles. Are there other things that we should look at as sending a signal to deter China?
Sure. So as I've said publicly before, the level of effort spending to think about in Replicator in FY24 is around 500 million, and in FY25 is around 500 million. That's sort of the sum total of what we anticipate. This is a pathfinder. It's largely about reducing barriers inside our system in a process that the Vice Chairman and I run. But obviously there are dollars associated with getting the actual thousands on the 18 to 24 month timeline out the door. It is my fervent view that follow on to that is a significant investment potential that is not about replicator, that is about what the services are going to be able to do on autonomy once we're able to lower those barriers through that initial investment.
So I think any adversary should look at the budget and notice at least 3 or 4 things. The first is the continued sustainment of funding for the nuclear enterprise and the reprioritization and modernization of the nuclear triad. That shows you our strong commitment to the importance of that mission area. Secondly is space. The Deputy Secretary talked about that. And as we think to the future and where we're going to win, I think it would become one of our great asymmetric advantages along with the undersea. So I would look hard at what we're doing in space. And then I guess the third one would be the readiness that I just talked about. 147 billion out of 849. That's a big chunk of money in readiness. So we are ready right now for a fight tonight.
Okay, Tony Capaccio, Bloomberg.
One quick question. There's $500 million for Taiwan. It's the first time ever a PDA. Can you talk a little bit about the rationale for it? Is it a message to China? And why 500 million versus some other larger figure? And for Admiral Grady, as the head of the JROC, were there any the Joint Requirements Oversight Council, were there any investments that you pushed in the 25 budget to reflect lessons from the Ukraine war that the United States needs to counter?
So on Presidential Drawdown Authority for Taiwan, we were provided authority in the 24 NDAA, I believe, 24. And so this was our first opportunity, the 25 budget, to be on cycle to put forward funding in support of that authority. We believe 500 million is executable. It represents a strong down payment on the authorized level, and obviously we need to fit within the Fiscal Responsibility Act cap. So that's how we got to the amount there. What it will do for us is allow us, just as the replenishment for Ukraine allows us, it provides that backfill for the services for anything that we provide to Taiwan. We then would be able to look at how to keep ourselves ready in those same areas. So that 500 million will allow us to backfill ourselves for items that we might provide to Taiwan.
Yeah, lots to learn from what's happening in Ukraine right now. And as you know, the JROC takes a look at all of those things, and they make recommendations based on capability gaps that we might assess. We don't necessarily direct funding, can't direct funding, but we identify gaps which then can lead to requirements. I think, too, that I would point to you are both manned and unmanned systems. Particularly in the unmanned systems, how we deliver effects on the battlefield, whether they're ISR, so sensing on the battlefield, or then delivering kinetic and non-kinetic effects. Both of those then are something I think we're really learning in the situation in Ukraine. And oh, by the way, it isn't just in one domain; it's across all domains, to include the maritime.
Any money being funded? Any investments in this budget you could point to, or reflecting what you just said?
Yeah, I think what if you were to look at the work of the Joint Counter UAS Office and the work that they're doing which is also playing out in the situation in the Middle East, you can see where those requirements are translating into how we think about that fight.
Louis Martinez from ABC, please.
Hi, Madam Secretary. Chairman Rogers is already out with a statement saying that while this budget keeps up with the Fiscal Responsibility Act, he says it's not keeping pace with inflation as a top line and with 4 adversaries. I'd just like to get your thoughts on that, because he's looking forward as to future, that actually the way this budget is structured right now puts us at a disadvantage in the future. And Admiral, I'd like to ask you about the Red Sea operations. What is the current burn rate for operations there? Because if you already have, let's say, more than 200 uses of anti-missile systems, how are you able to replenish that in the future, given all the other constraints that you're under for Ukraine as well?
So the Fiscal Responsibility Act is the law. We also think it represents an opportunity to get timely appropriations. And as I commented here, that's our priority, on time, adequate, appropriate appropriations. The back and forth over top line inevitably will occur over the course of the coming congressional cycle. We obviously look forward to engaging Congress. But I just really have to stress what we believe in this department, whatever can get us to actually a bipartisan agreement that produces appropriations is high priority for us. So if that's the FRA, and as I said, it is already the law, that is absolutely fine with us. I will also stress, as I said in my comments, we believe we need out-year growth, that FRA for 25, we can make the strategy work as long as we can realize that out-year growth, particularly for some of the longer-term investments that we have to grow capabilities, for example, after 2030, capabilities that would produce after 2030.
Yeah, thank you. The situation in the Red Sea is a dynamic one, as you know. I'm sure you've been following it. You talk about the munitions expenditure rate, so certainly something that we watch very closely. Very proud of the work of your joint force at sea and what they have been able to do to protect shipping and really to back up the international rules-based order there and freedom of navigation. As to the burn rate at sea, we won't get into the specifics of what we're shooting and how much. Suffice it to say, I'm very comfortable that we have enough of what we need and that we are a learning organization. And so as we apply the concepts of defense in depth, it isn't always an expensive SM-2 missile that gets shot at a UAS. We've learned how to use other systems and have rapidly adjusted to this concept of defense in depth. And that's what gives me great confidence that we'll be able to sustain that as long as it takes to change the calculus over there.
We're about out of time, so I think we're going to wrap it up right there. I do appreciate everybody for coming, and want to thank Deputy Secretary Hicks and Vice Chairman Grady as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Okay. And good afternoon. Thank you for coming. I'm Christopher Sherwood, OSD Public Affairs. Today's briefing is on the Department of Defense's fiscal year 2025 budget request. Speaking with you today are Undersecretary of Defense Comptroller, Chief Financial Officer Michael J. McCord, and Director for Structure Resources Assessment with the Joint Staff, Vice Admiral Sarah A. Joyner. They will provide opening remarks and take a few questions. Attribution is on the record. Prior to asking your question, please state your name and affiliation. Please limit your questions to one and one follow-up. I will let you know when we're nearing the end and we have time for one last question. With that, it's my pleasure to introduce the Honorable Mike McCord and Vice Admiral Sarah Joyner.
Thank you very much, Chris. Thank you all for being here today. Vice Admiral Joyner and I, as Chris said, are going to give you an overview of the budget request, and then we're happy to take some questions. I want to start by thanking Admiral Joyner and the whole Joint Staff team, from the Deputy Secretary, the Vice Chairman on down. We have ourselves and CAPE, Joint Staff, try and bring that corporate overview to everything that we do to help us through this very robust process it takes to build a budget, where you kind of hear some of the problems from the bottom up, you bring the strategy from the Secretary at the top down, and you try and make sure everyone's heard, the COCOMs and the components as well, to make sure that we get this to be the best product that we can be. So I want to thank everyone that was involved in building this budget. Only two of us get to sit here and sort of present it, but it was the work of many people. With that, let me turn to the first slide, which I can see is already up. Very good. The strategy is the same strategy, as you know, that the Secretary put out in late 2022. This is the third budget fully informed by that strategy. You'll see a lot of continuity in this budget, therefore. Continuity of strategy, of priorities, of programs, of funding levels. There's going to be more that you expect than surprises you, I believe, in this budget as you get a chance to go through it. The flow of this briefing is also somewhat similar to last year, help you kind of compare from last year to this year. So with that, I won't belabor the strategy again, that there is nothing new on that front. Let's get to the numbers real quickly. Again, big picture wise, this should not be a surprise to you, because the top line was agreed to in June of 2023. So not quite a year ago, but several 9 months ago, in the Fiscal Responsibility Act. So we marked to that top line. Again, everybody should have been expecting that. I think probably was expecting that. so we follow the law there. This chart, as you will see, we do not have anything filled in FY25 for supplemental. There is no supplemental attached to this budget. We, of course, are very interested in getting Congress to get across the finish line the supplemental that was sent last October that is still on the plate there. The Senate passed a very good bill. We need Congress to act as a whole on that. I can speak to that more in Q&A. I won't go too long on the supplemental because it is technically not part of this budget, other than to say it is essential that we get action on that. We as the United States extended our hand of friendship and support to Ukraine when they were attacked, and we should not be withdrawing that support now. We do need that supplemental. Everything else in here, again, tracks very closely with last year. The Fiscal Responsibility Act top line is, as you know, about a 1% increase over last year's level, which is less than the rate of inflation, as everybody, I'm sure, knew at the time when they set the top line. So we do not have positive real growth in this budget, but again, that was as intended by our elected officials who agreed on the top line last year. Okay, with that, let me just make one brief commercial about, to reinforce what the Deputy Secretary just said about the insidious kind of nature of continuing resolutions. I came up with this chart to kind of portray it in a different way. Some of you have heard me talk about this before. I do get tired of complaining about it, but unfortunately the problem persists. We have been in a continuing resolution or a CR where we're not able to make positive steps forward, but can only keep doing what we were doing last time for now approaching 1,800 days as of March 22nd when we get to the end of this current CR. 1,800 days out of the last 15 years. So it's an average of about 5 years, or out of 15, 1/3 of the time we have been stuck in neutral rather than moving forward. That is a dysfunctional, a harmful, unhealthy pattern that really needs to stop, and I know it is not that our appropriations committees are unable or unwilling to write a bill, or that there are necessarily anything specific to defense that is causing a lot of these delays. You know, there's sort of the larger difficulty of getting deals in Washington that has proven time and again to be just driving a lot of slow behavior. And I think the Deputy Secretary just alluded to certainty. Having your funding in a timely manner is as important as having more funding. Years ago, people were already, I know former Chairman Dempsey spoke about this, about having some certainty is just as important as getting more money 6 months late. In this case, the Fiscal Responsibility Act was supposed to provide some certainty. So far that hasn't panned out in getting 24 done faster. We do hope that will be the case for 25. Flipping to the next chart, if we could. This just shows you kind of where the top line has been under the 4 budgets that this administration has submitted, reading from top to bottom, FY22 being the light blue one. The green one, FY23, the first one fully informed by our strategy, was a pretty healthy increase once we got the strategy underpinning of what we were trying to do. Another increase last year, and then in 24. This year's budget, which is the red line, I know it can be hard to see from where you're sitting, very much tracks last year's, which is the blue line, the dark blue line at the top, except for the 1-year hit in FY25, which is the Fiscal Responsibility Act. That's about $10 billion, or a little over 1% decrement to what we had planned. Deputy Secretary Hicks spoke about the importance of getting back on track. That's what our plan does. It gets back on track in 26, 27, 28 to what we had said before. So we do need to get back to more positive growth, but we understand, and as I said, submitted as a law for this year. Let me now turn to the next chart, which is on our end strength. Most of the other charts, probably all of the other charts in this briefing, are about money. There's implicitly dollar signs in front of them, but before we do all that, just talk for a second about the most important part of what we have here, which is our people, which is not just their quantity, which is on this chart, but their quality and their skills are really what makes this department go. Our end strength, as you can see, again, this one probably you need to have it up close and personal to see all the details on this chart, is a very slight decrease, about 0.6% total force structure, total strength, less than where we project to end this year 6 months from now. So this is a projection for a year and a half from now. Minor change from this year. We probably, many of you who cover this know that we have had some recruiting challenges, but strong retention, so a bit of a mixed picture on the Manning side over the last couple of years. Continues to be the lowest unemployment rate in the history of the all-volunteer force, that is over 50 years. 2 years in a row, 22, 23 lowest unemployment rates we've had. I think most people know that that creates a bit of a challenge because the people you're trying to recruit, the talent you're trying to get in, have so many opportunities to do other things. And so that's not a bad problem to have, but it is a problem that we have in the Defense Department as we're competing for talent and trying to do that with unemployment being as low as it is. So with that, I think it's time for me to turn to Admiral Joyner to talk about some of the particular capability areas that really make up the bulk of what we look at when we go through our review of the different parts of integrated deterrence and military power.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Mr. McCord. Wanted to say up front that in the face of increasingly complex security challenges across the globe and competing demands in our nation, our uniformed service members appreciate the hard work and support of the Department's leadership and Congress in these unprecedented times. The FY25 budget request reflects our efforts to balance the Department's priorities under a top-line constraint to maintain a ready, lethal, and combat-credible joint force. You will see those priorities reflected in the investment slides that follow. This year, our air power request focuses on advanced fighter and mobility platforms and makes prudent revisions to our future aviation programs to ensure that we appropriately pace our competitors. Next, the request increases the capacity and capability of our maritime forces, ensuring the Navy remains a relevant deterrent while also increasing and optimizing our industrial base. The budget request also provides the troops on the ground with improved firepower, maneuver, and command and control. These investments directly support Marine Corps and Army modernization efforts, ensuring they remain dominant on land. Our investment in platforms and systems across these domains increases the lethality of our joint force and enhances our ability to deter threats while we adapt to the future. Today's nuclear enterprise is safe, secure, effective, and credible. And all three legs of the triad are ready if called upon. However, all three legs of the triad are undergoing a generational modernization effort. The FY25 budget request makes a significant investment in the nuclear enterprise as an essential component of integrated deterrence to ensure its continued efficacy. This budget increases funding for Columbia-class ballistic missile submarines through the submarine industrial base, as well as a ramp-up in advanced procurement funding to support a planned procurement of 1 submarine per year beginning in FY26. The request continues development and procurement of the B-21 program and supports key modernization efforts for the B-52. It also revitalizes several S&T efforts focused on evolving threats. This budget seeks to modernize NC3 senior leader communications required to maintain continuity of operations in times of crisis. And though the Sentinel program is currently undergoing a Nunn-McCurdy certification, it is fully funded in the FY25 request. Finally, the FY25 budget expands the nation's defensive posture with additional investments and enhancements to missile defense capabilities. These critical programs defend the homeland, deployed forces, and allies and partners against increasingly complex threats, particularly from China and Russia. Long-range fires is an important component of our modernization effort. Hypersonic weapons and other long-range missiles provide offensive capabilities to hold adversary targets at risk while reducing risk to U.S. forces and equipment. The Department is requesting nearly $10 billion in PB-25 to continue developing air, sea, and ground-launched weapons to provide flexibility and impose operational, technical, and fiscal challenges on potential adversaries. This substantial investment is over 39% more than our last enacted budget, FY23 of $7.2 billion. Building on several recent successes, this budget procures a lethal and survivable mix of network long-range weapons and maximizes procurement of critical maritime strike capabilities that directly address the priority national security challenges. These investments will grow the Department's advanced offensive fires capability and field operational multi-domain hypersonic capabilities beginning in the mid-2020s to achieve maximum deterrent threat against a peer adversary. Our adversaries continue to field weapons that could deny or destroy our space capabilities. a critical component of the U.S. power projection. To meet these potential threats, the Department is investing in resilient and combat-credible space capabilities that enhance lethality and the effectiveness of our joint force. We've made significant investments in previous budgets to ensure we can provide reliable space support in competition or conflict. We are now focused on ensuring those systems remain funded and deliver as planned. The request continues the path of those previous budgets and invests in resilient capabilities with the goal of denying first-mover advantage to any potential adversaries. Our budget also includes funding for essential position, navigation, and timing modernization, and invests in the development of protected satellite communications and targeting systems that can operate in contested environments. Finally, the budget request maintains an active eye on increasing competition for space by procuring launch vehicles that provide assured access, along with funds for modernizing our infrastructure. The FY 2025 cyber activities budget focuses modest investments into 3 portfolios, covering cybersecurity, cyberspace operations, and cyber research and development activities. The cybersecurity budget request improves our cyber posture by funding development and modernization in cybersecurity tools and capabilities. It also expands investment in zero trust technology to ensure the department can fully secure and protect its data. Similarly, the cyberspace operations request increases cyber mission force team training and readiness, increases ally and partner outreach via hunt forward activities, and improves capabilities, access, and infrastructures. In recognition of the rapidly adaptive nature of cyber, the R&D request focuses on emerging cyber prototypes and development, and AI and machine learning enabled capabilities and technologies. Cyber capabilities will continue to be a crucial component of our national defense and accordingly a top priority within our budget. The Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff has charged the Joint Force to be ready to fight today's battles, but also prepare for tomorrow's wars. But we cannot just focus on modernization at the risk of today's operations. The Secretary of Defense has made it clear through a deliberate effort reflected in this request to preserve the gains we have made in resourcing readiness. The highlights of these efforts are reflected on this slide. The FY25 budget invests more than ever to ensure our joint force is ready to respond to any strategic challenge. As mentioned, the budget was purposely designed to prioritize the near-term warfighting capability and readiness efforts displayed while sustaining ongoing modernization efforts. Overall, the Department's strategic readiness effort framework keeps our eyes on multiple horizons so that we can counter near-term threats and meet the challenges we expect to face in long-term strategic competition or high-end conflict. And I'll now turn it back over to Mr. McCord to discuss further budget priorities.
Thank you, Admiral. Next chart we have is on, and just to step back, hopefully you all remember that the strategy is kind of described in 3 areas: integrated deterrence, which Admiral Joyner discussed, and some of the modernization programs; campaigning, which has 2 aspects: the readiness and the building readiness of the force, day to day, month to month, that she just described; and then the campaigning part, which is the more deliberate use of our presence and our exercises and our activity to achieve planned outcomes. So on the campaigning side, the 2 things that people think of most are: what are we doing in the Indo-Pacific, what are we doing in Europe? And there are particular descriptors, boxes, if you will, that Congress has set up, or the previous administration set up, called Pacific Deterrence Initiative, European Deterrence Initiative. As you know, neither of these are particularly descriptive of everything that we do in these theaters, or especially of the forces that can be flowed by the Secretary between theaters. But these are lenses that the committees have asked us to use, and so we're showing you here what we have on both of those: $9.9 billion on Pacific deterrence and about $4.2 billion on European deterrence. On Pacific deterrence, probably the biggest new news, which I believe the Deputy Secretary just alluded to, was that we now have funding in to follow in on or fall in on the NDAA authorization of drawdown for Taiwan. We now have $500 million in this budget to put funding against that. Possibly, would have liked to have done a little more, but this being a capped year, we thought that was a good way to start against the $1 billion a year ceiling in the authorization. On Europe, again, as you know, the big issue is the supplemental that is pending before Congress, not the more stable, much smaller part that is binned as European deterrence. Okay, with that, let me turn to the next slide, and sort of the last leg of the strategy. Again, just to refresh, I'm sure you all know this, is building enduring advantages refers to having a healthy institution that has good practices and quality that can sustain itself. That refers both to the force itself, particularly the people in uniform and their families, but also the entire force, military and civilian, and then the industrial base that we work with to deliver capability. So taking the people side first. First leg of this, pay and compensation, not everything, but an important thing. The budget has this year a 4.5% pay raise. Those of you who are familiar with the formula that drives that is consistent with the law. It is nothing out of the ordinary there. But in the last 3 years now, we had last year, as many of you remember, the largest pay raise in 20 years. Combined across the last 3 years, that's now up to 15% pay raise for the troops, in addition to very substantial increases in housing allowances and subsistence allowances, just on the basic pay that everybody gets, up 15% over 3 years. On the civilian side, the pay raise is 2%. That, I think, is fair to say that's an administration-wide decision that is not made here in the department, because all civilians are treated equally across federal agencies in that respect. I do think it's fair to assume that the pressure of the Fiscal Responsibility Act cap, which hits every cabinet agency, was a factor in the thinking about why the civilian pay raise could be less this time than what the military pay raise is. But even so, the civilian pay raise will be 12.2% across the last 3 years in this budget. Other compensation thing I just want to highlight is that for a couple years now, the authorization bill has promoted a concept that became to be defined as basic needs allowance, looking at the kind of the particular needs of perhaps a more economically pressed part of the department, maybe junior enlisted, those with families. Congress has taken action a couple years in a row to revisit this issue. It's kind of stabilizing now, but we are proposing in this budget to go from 150% of poverty level as the income threshold to qualify for this allowance to opening the door a little bit more to 200%. We think that's a positive step that I hope will find favor with the committees when they see it. So those are kind of the two big highlights on the compensation side. On the next slide, flip side of taking care of people, beyond pay and compensation, occur all the things you do to take care of the health of your force, providing child care, looking after issues like suicide prevention, sexual assault prevention. Here we continue to implement initiatives that are high priorities of the Secretary and other military and civilian leaders across this department. This is not news probably to any of you, but we are continuing to build out, especially on the sexual assault prevention, the historic NDAA provisions from a couple years ago, to now hire the people up and build the structure to make it actually real. So again, not new initiatives so much as continuing to build out what was already laid in on that front. Now, the second part of building enduring advantages, as I said, refers to kind of the industrial base and to the way that we deliver technology. In my view, that's probably within the overall frame that I had, that there is a lot of continuity in this budget, a lot of continuity of priorities and approaches. Probably the biggest area, I would say, of new emphasis from both the Deputy Secretary and the Vice Chairman is on innovation and agility. And I'm not talking about the biggest dollar shifts here, more about the biggest mental shifts and the biggest push, whether it's on JADC2, Replicator, Radar, all these sort of things, to try and get faster, get better, and have impacts at the margin. So you won't see necessarily giant dollars on a number of these things, but the emphasis is important. Many of you have heard the Deputy Secretary talk about the Radar Rapid Defense program to get experimentation results faster out into operationalizing them, if you will. And something you may not be as familiar with, Office of Strategic Capital is the Secretary of Defense priority, where we have needed congressional action to give us authorities that we did not possess as a Defense Department to make loans, to have an interaction with smaller vendors that might need that to get to do business with us. We got step one in the NDAA that was enacted in December with authorities. If the appropriations bill can get across the finish line with funding to put against those authorities in the next 2 weeks, we will be up and running. But we've already got a good leg up in the NDA to get the authorities that we did not have. So that's one example. Radar is another. And then on the next slide, I believe I heard the Deputy Secretary already talk about the Replicator Initiative, which is yet another, again, the impact is, we hope, will be outsized to the dollar amount, which is not the point here, but the idea of imposing costs on the adversary in a more effective way than we sometimes are able to by getting more things fielded more quickly. Next thing on industrial base, two more aspects. You've heard us, again, this is an area of continuity. The last couple years we talked about some key technologies, microelectronics, casting and forging, critical materials. Those have been and remain emphasis of industrial base. We now have an industrial base strategy, which probably many of you are familiar with, that came out, I want to say, a month or a little more ago. I've probably lost track of time exactly, but a fairly new industrial base strategy, some continuing particular investments, and then submarine industrial base, you have heard us and will hear us talk a lot about as a particularly important and impactful industrial base. And then on the next slide, if I can kind of segue into that a little bit, munitions industrial base, which was probably the biggest message we had in last year's budget, that we were proposing multi-years on missiles and munitions in a space that hadn't had that before. We are still waiting, unfortunately. It's now a year since we submitted that budget, 52 weeks right now, and we are hopeful to get that across the line soon. We don't have the funding or the authority to do those multi-years, so sad to say we've lost months that we could have been moving out on that. The other part of helping the munitions industrial base, which I know you all are familiar with, particularly on ground munitions, on a subset of munitions, is Ukraine supplementals. We have provided a lot to Ukraine. We need the funding to come back in to replenish those inventories. The proposal we had last year in the spring between the multi-years and last fall in the supplemental was kind of a 1-2, boost to that industrial base, and we don't have either of those things finalized yet. So that's a hindrance to where we would want it to be at this time, but there is still an ability to get moving in the right direction if we can get those two pieces across the line, hopefully at the same time in 2 weeks. There are no new multi-years in this budget. We don't have any of the ones from last year started. It seemed a little unrealistic to jump into new ones given where we actually are. I'll go quickly over the last couple slides here. The next slide is on sort of the business side of the health of the institution, including but not limited to audit and many other performance improvement areas. I believe that our DoD strategic management plan is also being posted today by a different office, possibly through our same link on our website. Not my office isn't the owner of that, but there's more detail on any number of management priorities in another document that you should see today. Final area that I want to hit is on the installation side. As many of you know, we did finally get our FY24 military construction family housing funding approved, signed by the President on Saturday. So as I like to say, that's 2% of our top line down, only 98% to go in the defense appropriations bill coming. You got to start somewhere. But we do appreciate that, and we do have a continued emphasis on both the quality of life and the mission side. And speaking of submarine industrial base, in addition to investing in the industrial base through the acquisition accounts and the operating accounts where we're talking about workforce, talking about the supply chain, then we've got the infrastructure side. Many of you know we're now in, I think, the third year of the so-called SIOP, the 20-year Navy shipyard investment plan, in the 4 public yards. Again, a big investment in that this year. So that's the infrastructure leg of the submarine industrial base, or submarine maintenance industrial base in this case, in addition to family housing and barracks, which are an important part of what we're doing here. And hopefully expanded, if we can get this approved, expanded investments in Indo-Pacific infrastructure, which is part of our whole warfighting plan and operational plan for that theater. So with that, I think we're ready to take your questions. Again, the strategy here and the framework, the funding levels, there should be a lot that is kind of what you would have expected based on the top line that we're set and on the direction that we have followed pretty consistently, I want to say, over the last couple of years.
Okay, we'll start with Mike Stone.
Hi, Mike Stone from Reuters. You mentioned Replicator. The Secretary said that there was about 500 for Replicator, but there's no line item in the budget. So is that going to come from reprogramming, or how is that going to be? How is that 500 going to be found? And for the Admiral, there's a lot of activity, particularly by the Navy right now, When do you expect a supplemental for that activity? Let's use OCO as the example, as a previous example. And how big do you expect the supplemental to be? Thank you.
Okay, on a replicator, a reprogramming is a possible solution in FY24, the year that we're halfway through. Should not be necessary in 25 because we're proposing it in the budget. Our first hope for FY24, and the deputy has personally engaged with the committees on this, is that they will work with us to put some funding in the appropriations conference that we hope to see in 2 weeks, and therefore a reprogramming would be moot because the funding would be done and in that bill. So step one is to see, were they able to get that in there, and is the bill able to get to the president's desk? And then if it is not, then reprogramming will have to be the approach. On if I can sort of, I know she's going to arm wrestle me this, but the on the supplement, if you're referring to operations in CENTCOM, for example, the Navy's undertaking, yeah, we the quickest way home. I'm going to sound like a broken record on some of these issues, perhaps. The quickest way home for us to get help there is the supplemental Senate already passed, which had $2.5 billion in there, 2.4 to be precise, for Central Command area of responsibility. Response cost, and that could be operating costs, which the Navy is bearing the brunt of, but not all of. In addition, it could be replacement costs, replacements of munitions that have been fired. So all of those were eligible recipients of the extra funding that the Senate added. That was an opportunity for us to work with them, by the way, where the committees asked us, after we submitted a supplemental in early October, or in mid-October, I'm sorry, shortly after the Hamas attack on Israel, we did not have any of those costs projected in there. We had absolutely no data in the first 2 weeks for which to do that. But unfortunately, the supplemental didn't get acted on quickly, and so here we are months later that we've had time to communicate with the committees on some of those costs, and the result of that was the Senate adding funding in for that. So that would be a big help to us if we could get that across the line. That would give us a real opportunity to get started on replenishing either stockpiles or operating costs. The Army, of course, has the same issue in EUCOM, Army and the Air Force, all services, but the Army has borne more of the brunt in Europe, the Navy more so in CENTCOM. But either way, the supplemental is the quickest way home to addressing costs that we have been incurring every day since October 1st that need some way to be absorbed or funded.
Tony Capaccio.
A couple questions. One, on the procurement budget, it was $167 billion versus $175 that was projected last year. The Virginia class and the F-35 were reduced. Can you address both of those? Were those strictly budget driven because that's where the money was, or was the Virginia class's delivery schedule and the F-35's TR-3 software problems, were those drivers? And for the Admiral, any specifics on where the JROC focused investments this time? I asked Admiral Grady, and he gave a broad answer, but you're the point-specific budgeteer, so I'd ask you.
Okay, on procurement writ large, you're correct that procurement, if you look at last year's plan compared to where we ended up and where is the single place where the most of that $10 billion reduction occurred, it was in procurement. Hopefully the Secretary or the overall DoD press release is available right now. There's a very direct quote right in there where the Secretary addresses his guidance that we prioritize readiness and taking care of our people, and where we had to take some additional risk to take it in the acquisition of newer technologies. So that is reflected in the procurement number tracks with a statement which hopefully you've seen, but if you haven't seen it should be filtering its way out any minute here. On Virginia class was not a budget-driven decision. Every decision that we make obviously only happens once in a budget that has a particular top line, but that's not the same as saying that every decision in this $850 billion budget was about how to take the $10 billion. And Virginia class is probably the primary example of something that was a management decision the Navy proposed that got considerable discussion inside the group, and I think we all felt that it made sense. I believe the boats that are delivering, are supposed to deliver this year, are averaging over 30 months late, and we have more than a dozen on order that are still in production already. So the question was really, what can we do to get a better result other than keep doing the same thing and hoping for a different result than what has happened the last couple of years? So we've already had some beginnings of submarine industrial base investments. It was a priority in last year's budget, which again, we don't have that money yet, so that's a problem. But you look at last year's budget, this year's budget, and the AUKUS so-called supplemental, there's a big investment in sort of three parts in the sub-industrial base that we think is going to be money better spent than putting another submarine on order that all analysis indicates we can't get 2 submarines if we order them in 25 any sooner than if we wait. F-35, as you alluded to, has some issues with it's a little behind schedule where we would like it to be in delivering technology. Therefore, it made sense to look at whether or not, the ramp could be adjusted. But I will say that when people get to look through this budget, they will see 4th gen, 5th gen, and 6th gen all had some reductions in investment. It's not just that one program. And again, it's easy to assume that maybe every program decision, was related to the top line. That's not the case. So there are reasons why, based on technology's readiness, changes in behavior by your adversaries or your allies, or all kinds of management decisions might feed into why you relatively change priorities. But again, thank you for the question, because Virginia class, to be clear, was trying to sort of get to a better, more healthy dynamic where we can get to the 2 submarine a year production rate, and we thought that going a different direction was our best move in that case.
Thank you.
Could
you talk a little bit about?
Ask her about,
my
I asked her a
bad.
J-Rock question.
So my boss absolutely got it right. The JROC is a top-down process. That's really where we focus. We still get the bottom up from the services. The top-down process is really focused on key gaps and capabilities. We're looking for end-to-end kill chain types of capabilities as we move forward. We don't use funding, but we do use requirements. So we're setting the requirements overall, and I think they would be very familiar with you. They would be in the CJAD C2 long-range fires, the nuclear deterrence areas. I think in missile defense, I think, are some of the biggest buckets. But part of what we focused on this year, both for the budget side and the JROC side, is really delivering and understanding those end-to-end capabilities and finding those gaps from the top down. So that's what he's really focused. The JROC, as the chairman of the JROC, but with the members, they've really focused on getting those end-to-end capabilities, setting those requirements, and identifying those areas where we need to focus more attention. Thank you.
Could you tell us a little bit about the inflation challenge in this budget, how it's changed over the year? You mentioned that it doesn't keep pace with the rate of inflation. So do you have a figure for the lost buying power the department's suffering as a result of inflation? And what does the department say inflation is right now? I know there's a complex sort of formula you all use for it.
Yeah, the inflation rate, I will ask my team to correct me if I'm wrong. I think that the inflation rate built into the budget from 24 to 25 is 2.1% or thereabouts. So it is more than 1%, as again I think everybody reasonably expected when they set the top line. Pay has come in at a healthy number again because of the formulas in law which we followed. On the military side, we restrain civilian, the administration restrained civilian pay raises to kind of help keep our costs under control that way. Overall, this is a bit healthier picture, of course, than we had. Inflation when we were here a year ago was considerably higher, and you've seen it come down. The numbers that come out every month, the 12-month moving averages are now starting with 3, and all the forecasts are moving in the direction of us having gotten through this situation with a softer landing than probably many of us would have expected, and which is very welcome news given that economic strength of the economy is important to us. So as I said, unemployment has remained low, which gives us our own little challenge on recruiting perhaps, but it's a good thing for the country. Inflation coming back down at the same time is overall a good news story. We are not, we are the recipients of that. We don't manage inflation ourselves that way, and we do use the inflation rates that are consistent across the government. So it is coming down. Our forecast, I think, is probably not out of line with others, and so it's important that it stay on track and keep decreasing, and that will help us be in better shape.
I have time for 1 or 2 more questions. Sam?
Hi, Stan LeGrone from USNI News. You talked a little bit about the Virginia-class program and how those boats are slipping, and then the importance of the strategic weapon systems. Any parallel slippage maybe in the Columbia-class, or anything that y'all are concerned about as that program continues? I've noticed that build rate stays pretty consistent.
I would say, I'm not the expert here, that Columbia, of course, the industrial base is a shared one, right? The skill set of building nuclear submarines, and so the Virginia class doesn't stand entirely by itself in terms of that pressurization. I think the Navy right now, if I understand it right, is doing I want to say 45-day, I may have that number wrong, review of shipbuilding. Secretary Del Toro is concerned about schedule writ large, and I think that's being looked at right now. We believe, as I think the Admiral said, that the program is fully funded, but the Navy, who's following, may or may not be able to say anything more later this afternoon when they're here about the schedule on that particularly. I think it is being looked at right now in a Navy review.
Okay, Brandy.
Thank you. Thank you both so much for doing this. Two separate lines of questions on artificial intelligence. I noticed that the top line for AI requested in 25 is 1.8 billion, which is the same that was requested in 24. AI adoption seems like a top priority for the department, particularly now. Can you talk a little bit about why it appears to be flatlined and the reason for that? And then separately, AI is a broad term that refers to many things, and a lot of your sort of programs and portfolios have AI elements like CJAD, C2, Replicator, etc. So that AI top line, what all does that encompass, that 1.8 billion? Is it all the services and the CDAO and everything, or how are you thinking of what AI in that top line is?
Thanks. I think that this one probably merits us getting you a little one-pager. I do believe that basically my answer to your first question would be your second. It was the premise of your second question, that it is in so many things that it is difficult to measure precisely. That being said, if we put a number on a piece of paper, then we should be able to get you some more details of how we got it. But I do think that it is much as when I was here in this job the first time, cyber started the same way of, what is cyber, what is not cyber. It's a little hard to put your arms around, and therefore the number is not really necessarily reflective of the impact of it and the fact that it's in so many places. So we will get you a paper that takes our best stab at how we got that number, but that's probably the best I can do.
One quick follow-up on Replicator. You said that it's going to be included. It's included in the FY25. Where exactly is that? Because I understand it's not in the Air Force requests.
At this time, we have, as we finish this off, this was one of the later programs to bring to a close in building this budget. There was a debate which I think is maybe, at the time things went to press, certainly was not settled about the so-called reveal conceal, how much detail we wanted to put out. And given that if I cross the bridge into putting everything out, I can't go back, we're sort of leaning on the side of not disclosing the details until we are confident that that's what the Deputy Secretary wants to do. So I know that she mentioned an overall number. I don't believe that we're in a position yet to put out details of which programs in which service that we're doing, and the discussions that she had with the committees were all done at a classified level of what particular Replicator initiatives were. So we're trying to protect her decision space on that.
So it's classified, right?
It is classified at this time. That is, the conversation will continue both internally and with the committees, and so that might change. But at this time, as I said, my incentive is to err. If I'm erring on the side of not revealing it too soon,
Okay, I see. And then a second question. I saw in the Army budget that PRISM buy has increased. I'm wondering at what point does the Army start accepting that missile, and does that free up our ATACMS that we could then potentially send to Ukraine?
I know Undersecretary Camarillo will be out soon, and he probably has more detail on that. But I would say similar to what comments I've made on a couple of programs here of, we had a munitions request that we made a year ago that we still don't have. So the time that they'll be able to implement the FY25 budget on PRISM partly depends on, is the FY25 budget going to get enacted this fall, maybe before the elections, or not till a year from now. I mean, that's a big swing of months that we have seen. We've seen different results. There are times when Congress makes a push before a presidential election to get a budget done in September. That's sadly the exception. So if we get one of those, the Army will gain a couple months right there. But beyond that, I would say the Army, when they come out here, will probably be able to speak to that particular program management issues better than I could, for sure.
But you're saying that procurement won't start until we get a budget for.
Well, I'm saying the 25 budget, here we are waiting for the budget we submitted a year ago, that how fast we get stuff, it's quite relevant to how soon we can actually get going on contract.
I thank you all for your time. That's all we have time for. Thank you.